Somehow it has become ingrained in popular gaming culture that the calls for the Great Crash had to do with just two bad games that were released for the Atari 2600, Pac-Man and E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. Other rumors blame the number of consoles on the market, the number of third-party developers, and even the PC industry. As we review the real reasons for the crash, each of these popular myths will be dispelled. The Great Crash refers to a period of time when the North American video game industry fell from $3.2 billion in annual sales to only $100 million. That's a drop of 97%. Now ask yourself, does it stand to reason that just two bad video games could crash an entire industry? Of course not. For the entire market to have crashed, then more than just two games for only one console would have had to be involved. There were lots of factors at play which contributed to the crash. As we examine the core causes, we'll find that none of them had anything to do with anything that's remotely otherworldly. To picture the industry in 1982, Atari was the fastest growing company in America. Its flagship console, the Video Computer System, or VCS, which today we popularly call the Atari 2600, was released in 1977 and was really beginning to show its age. In fact, it was originally intended to have been phased out in 1980. Atari's primary competitor had been Mattel Electronics with their Intellivision console, which was soft released in 1979 and marketed nationwide the following year in 1980. Though there were other consoles on the market at the time, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Fairchild Channel F, and Bally Astrocade, they were either relegated to the back seat or were already past their time. Let's take a brief look. Fairchild Semiconductor sold Channel F to tool manufacturer Zircon, which by this time had made it a mail-order only item. Astrocade was also mail-order only at this point, having been sold by Bally to Astrovision. Only the Magnavox Odyssey 2 remained on store shelves alongside the Atari and Intellivision consoles, and even then it only sold 1 million units. In the fall of 1982, a new console race was beginning, along with a new generation. In August, Coleco beat Atari to the market with ColecoVision, a next-gen console with greatly enhanced capabilities. Through the use of an add-on, it even had backwards compatibility with Atari 2600's massive library of games. It would be like today if Nintendo came out with Wii 3 and announced compatibility with PS4 and Xbox One games.
Play all Atari 2600 compatible cartridges. And with all of ColecoVision's cartridges, that means you can play more games than any other video game system.
4 months later, Atari responded with its own next-gen console, the 5200 Super System. The war was on. The popular ColecoVision, with its Pac-Man game, Nintendo's Donkey Kong, would go on to outsell the 5200 by a margin of more than 2 to 1. Philips Magnavox, still not wanting to be left out, was completing R&D on Odyssey 3. So no, there was no consumer confusion over the number of consoles. From 1980 to 1982, only Atari, Intellivision, and Odyssey 2 even advertised on television. No one had ever even heard of a Channel F or an Astrocade, and consumers didn't walk into Sears and have a choice between 5 consoles. There was for the most part either Atari or Intellivision, with Odyssey 2 having just some market presence. Think about it. It'd be like in the 90s if consumers were confused between the Super Nintendo, Genesis, Neo Geo, Jaguar, CDI, Laseractive, CD32, Commodore 64 GS, the Turbo Duo, and VIS. No, they weren't. There was just Sega and Nintendo, and everyone else watched from the bleachers. I bet most of you who grew up in the 90s never even heard of some of those. Yeah, consumers in the 1980s never even heard of the Arcadia 2001 either. Beginning in 1979 with Activision, which was the first independent video game publisher and developer, more and more third-party companies began cropping up and releasing games. Originally, the console makers published and developed their own games for their own systems. Now new companies could sell games for existing consoles. Overnight, there were dozens of third parties. The only real problem for Atari is they weren't seeing any of the profits off these games that were being sold. Of course, the quality of these games, especially for the 2600, ranged from quality to crap. Though third parties had a role to play in the crash, the volume of, quote, bad games they produced is not a factor. In fact, popular games that are considered to be classics, like Centipede and Atlantis, caused more of the financial damage for their publishers than the bad games that almost no one bought. Am I saying that successful games contributed to the crash? Yes, I am. It sounds counterintuitive, but I'll explain why in just a little bit. It's important to understand the retail distribution system that was in place at the time. There wasn't Amazon.com or GameStop. If a small developer for the Atari 2600 wants to get their game on store shelves, then they needed to make an arrangement with a national department store like JCPenney, Sears, or Montgomery Ward. This wasn't easy to do, and in fact, very few third parties gained access to national retailers. Games were sold in local computer stores, toy stores, comic book shops, and largely via mail order catalog. The very small developer who was trying to release a very bad game did not have a wide distribution network. For instance, I've seen it specifically cited that 2600 games like Chase the Chuck Wagon, a Purina dog food game, and Pepsi Invaders, a code promotional tool, caused the crash because they were brand-based cash-ins that no one asked for. That almost sounds logical until any actual thought is applied. These games weren't even sold in stores. Chase the Chuck Wagon was a promotional video game, and Pepsi Invaders was only given out as a promotion at a Coca-Cola sales convention. It was kind of like how there was a series of Burger King games on Xbox, and Yo-Noid on NES, Cool Spot on Genesis, and dozens of other brand tie-in games that have been released in the years since, even recently. The only difference is those actually went to retail, and these ones that are being blamed for the crash never did. There's a reason why so many of these, quote, bad games are very rare and valuable today. They had low sales and low production. They weren't in stores. Few people ever played them, let alone heard of them. So no, they did not cause the crash, nor did they contribute to it in any way. What kicked off the whole fiasco actually happened in 1982. It was the 41st anniversary of a day which lives in infamy, the Imperial Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a Tuesday, December 7th, 1982. Warner Communications, Atari Inc.'s parent company, made its earnings announcement, and Atari executives revealed a projection of a 10 to 15% profit increase. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? A profit increase of 10 to 15%? Well, no. It was a total disaster. What seems like a positive forecast actually was below the 50% increase that Wall Street was expecting. The next day, Warner saw share prices fall from $51 a share to $35 a share, a drop of over 31%. That's a pretty freaking big stock drop. It sent shockwaves through the industry and caused the world's second largest third-party developer, Imagic, to hold off on a planned initial public offering. That being said, few, if any, contemporary observers interpreted this to mean that the end of video games was coming. Other arcade and console manufacturers, as well as third-party publishers, saw it as an opening, as a sign of their success. They were hurting the Atari juggernaut. But Atari, which was already in disarray due to interference from Warner's New York offices, began to implode. Their arcade, computer, and console divisions didn't even talk to each other. Though Atari had an offer from Nintendo to distribute the NES in America, this was apparently lost in the chaos and forgotten about. After a year of declines, in 1984, Atari did a soft launch of its third-generation console, the 7800 Pro system, an 8-bit console comparable to the NES in terms of graphical and audio capabilities. This was part of a company-wide effort to reinvent Atari as a profitable, lean, and innovative company. Their coming-out party was going to be during the 1984 Olympics, of which they were a sponsor. However, in July of that year, Warner sold Atari off to Tremel Technology. This was done behind the backs of Atari's CEO and senior leadership. Atari Inc. came to an end, and the Atari Corporation was born and was under the leadership of Drac Tremel, who had founded Commodore International. The new Atari would focus on personal computers, not video game consoles, and the 7800 was shelved due to a financial dispute. As the new ColecoVision succeeded and Atari 5200 gained steam after the 1982 holiday season, it spelled bad news for Mattel Electronics and their recently launched Intellivision 2, which was nothing more than a cosmetic redesign of their same last-gen hardware. On June 10, 1983, Mattel announced a deficit of $20.4 million. Sales fell 77.5% from over $97 million to just $20 million. And I'm quoting, "A severe competitive environment within the home video game and personal computer market was the primary cause of the drop." In reality, Intellivision was less than an attractive system to consumers. For a modern comparison, it would be like if Microsoft tried to market the original Xbox against the PS3. It doesn't make any sense. So, instead of developing a next-gen console, Mattel left the market and sold off their Intellivision business by 1984. ColecoVision continued to perform well almost through 1984. Had the company been more single-minded, they might have rescued the market all on their own by continuing to support the ColecoVision and developing a third-gen console. Instead, they ramped down their ColecoVision production and promotions in order to devote resources to their new project, the Coleco Atom. Atom was a family computer that came with a printer and a keyboard. It also played ColecoVision games. There was even a version released as an expansion module for the existing ColecoVision console that would upgrade it to be a full-fledged Atom computer. In reality, the amount of overlap between the computer market and the console market was very little, and Coleco found that out the hard way. Atom, which had severe technical issues, sucked up most of the company's revenue like some kind of a money-sucking Hoover. Coleco even burned through the money it gained from its popular Cabbage Patch Kids toy line. After spending $35 million in returns on defective Atom computers, Coleco left the electronics market completely in 1985. 3 years later, the company filed for bankruptcy. In the meantime, retailers were ordering games like crazy. This so-called retailer glut is the primary cause of the crash. Distributors and stores massively over-ordered games, and the publishers were required to accept the returns. For example, this was killing Imagic at the time, which was known for making great games. Activision is one of the few third parties to have survived this era. This is also where ET often gets brought up. Here's the rumor. Atari manufactured more ET carts than there were 2600 consoles in home. That's just the farthest thing from the truth. It's like a bad email chain letter that gets brought up every year. Like that the Earth will be so close to Mars that the red planet will actually appear larger in the sky than the moon. Let's do the math. First, millions of Atari 2600 consoles have been sold since it was introduced in 1977. Over 8 million were sold in 1982 alone. In contrast, only 2.5 million copies of ET were produced. Second, ET was released in December 1982. It had absolutely zero impact on Warner's December 7th shareholder meeting, as its sales hadn't yet been assessed. In fact, the notorious game sold over 1.5 million units, making it one of the fastest-selling video games in history to that point. It was second only to 1981's Pac-Man, which swiftly cleared over 2 million units. Speaking of Pac-Man, that game somehow gets the blame for the crash as well, even though it was released in 1981 and it was an unmitigated commercial success. Believe it or not, most people enjoyed the only home version of Pac-Man that they had access to. Pac-Man's bad rep comes not from its own era, but from the late 1990s when emulators became possible. You see, the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man uses kind of a flicker trick to make it appear that the character and all four ghosts are all on screen at once. Despite the 2600's hardware limitation that prevents it from displaying more than 2 sprites on screen at one time. Really, it was a technical achievement. However, emulators can't properly reproduce this trick, which makes Pac-Man seem like an unplayable flickery mess. Here's Pac-Man emulated. Now here it is again on a real Atari 2600. There's quite the difference. The other beef with Pac-Man is that it doesn't look like the arcade. Well, no duh. No games on 2600 looked like the arcade. This is super common. Check out the difference between Zaxxon on the arcades versus the 2600 version. Consumers weren't being tricked, they weren't fooled, they knew what they were getting. However, kids with emulators in 1997 didn't understand that, thus, the Atari Pac-Man myth begins. Now that we've covered Pac-Man, let's get back to E.T. To be perfectly honest, E.T. really doesn't deserve the worst game ever title that it gets. I can think of games that are far worse. Like Pac-Man, E.T. also earned its poor reputation in the mid to late 90s as technology allowed for emulators and ROMs to become prevalent. E.T. has an entirely different problem than Pac-Man did though. You see, unlike for example, Defender or Asteroids, how to play E.T. isn't at all self-explanatory. The player really needs to have the instructions to know how to play the game. Otherwise, there's literally no way to know what to do. Kids in the late 90s who were playing E.T. for the first time on their Atari 2600 emulators didn't have the instruction book and had no idea how to play it, so they fell in holes over and over, wondering what to do. Therefore, the game sucked. Well, the game is not amazing. It's not horrible either. It's pretty mediocre and can be completed in just a few minutes. It's an average example of an adventure game during the 2600 era. Though they were great sellers, Atari did lose money on both Pac-Man and E.T., and here's how. Retailers put in orders for 2.5 million copies of E.T. Atari sold 1.5 million in record time. The remaining 1 million had to be eaten by Atari as the unsold carts were returned. Yes, if the games didn't sell, then the retailers could return them. Whereas if that happened today, the retailer would be responsible for the cost. It wasn't just E.T. and Pac-Man that this happened to. It was the same story with every single popular video game. The more popular the game, the more that retailers overordered it, the more financial damage it caused the publisher. It's true that there was a total lack of control over third parties. Anyone who could shovel games onto a console did, especially for the 2600. But as the returns from retailers increased, most third-party developers went out of business like Data Age and US Games. Eventually, retailers didn't even have a place to send the games back to. That's why so many games ended up in the discount bin. That's what led to the perception by some that the market was overflooded with bad games. In reality, retailers ordered too many. Therefore, retailer glut is the primary cause of the crash. Home computers appeared to have a renaissance just as the console market was crashing, but that was out of pure coincidence. There was already a crash of sorts in the computer industry. At the same time that Atari was bleeding money, Texas Instruments, creator of the popular TI-9948 computer, lost $100 million. The famous Atari 8-bit line of computers, which began in 1979 with the Atari 400 and 800, was failing, even with the new XL series. The same goes for the Commodore VIC-20, the Tandy Color computer, and the original Apple II. So why is it that, if these computers were failing, that the computer market endured? Simple answer. Because unlike the console manufacturers, most companies in the home computer market released new hardware. Simple concept, right? The aging VIC-20 was replaced by the Commodore 64. Apple introduced the IIe, and the failed Atari 1200 XL was replaced by the much more successful 800 XL and other computers in the same line. When the console market dried up, what developers were left turned to making computer games. It was their only option. Gaming on computers thrived because there was almost no console market left in America at all. People still wanted to play video games, but they had to get them on more expensive computers. The crash could have been avoided at several turns. First, the giant in the industry, Atari, could have released the 7800 and began to innovate new games. In Atari's absence, Coleco, Mattel, or both could have held in and come out with a third-generation console. If anyone would have released a third-generation console in 1984, the market would have rebounded. It just turned out that no one came until 1985, and that company was Nintendo. That's how the crash was ended. Nintendo entered the North American market. They dropped their original plans to release a computer console hybrid, which was called the Advanced Entertainment System, or AES, and they made it inexpensive and more like a toy. Nintendo then implemented a quality program and licensed developers. Gamers in the United States were just waiting for someone to make a serious push for the market. Nintendo did, and gamers fell in love. Mario and Zelda are household names today. When Atari saw Nintendo's success and realized that the market, which they had once dominated, was valuable, they finally released the 7800 Pro system. But it was way too late. Nintendo was established. Ironically, the console that was ready to be the first of the third generation ended up being a distant third to the NES and Sega Master System. Neither bad games nor third-party developers nor pressure from the personal computer market caused the downfall of consoles in 1983. It is ridiculous for anyone to say that one or two bad video games are able to crash an entire industry. The ET myth is just an internet rumor that gets retold in creative and interesting ways. As time goes on, it continually gets told by credible people. It's an interesting tale in hubris, but it's simply not true. I genuinely hope the next time someone tells you that ET caused the crash or bad games were responsible, you'll reply to them that it was really retailer glut and many, many other factors.